So we're moving into the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is a period of about 900 years, and I've got it divided, this particular section, into the Jewish early Christian and Byzantine period, which technically predates the fall of the Roman Empire, which is supposed to be the beginning of the Middle Ages. It's important that you know that. The beginning of the Middle Ages is supposed to be the fall of the Roman Empire, which is around the year 500 AD. Um, Technically, the Judaic and early Christian period predate this because you remember from the Terrible Constantine video that he adopted Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, pushed out paganism, and that was in the fourth century. So it was much earlier than the fall of the Roman Empire. But a lot was developing beforehand that really came to develop a lot more strongly during the Middle Ages. But let's talk about this map. We'll cover a lot of that in the coming slides. So Constantinople here is the seat of the Byzantine Empire, and that's this word here. It'll be one of your key terms. The Byzantine Empire is called so because this particular area was referred to as Byzantium by the Greek cultures who lived here before. So Justinian was basically it was a throwback. Um, Justinian no longer felt like he or the people he led would have been appropriately called Roman. So he decided that from this point forward, we don't no longer have anything to do with the Romans. We're the Byzantines, even though technically this was part of the Roman Empire. So it was never actually fell. It really just sort of moved around and shifted and then changed names eventually. So let's go on to the next slide here. Now, this is the late 4th century, which would have been not long after Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity. But it's not uncommon to find this very early Christian imagery in places like catacombs, which are inherently underground. Would have been where they would have performed funerary rites, where they would have kept the dead bodies. But the reason that these things are underground is really twofold. One, it was probably a Christian structure used for Christian worship before the paintings existed. It was just something that had to have been done in secret. And catacombs, basements, places like that are underground are just a lot easier to keep secret. Now, what you see on the ceiling here is it's an icon. You can tell by that is a Christ figure. And that's why the reason for that is the term iconography. That's another key term. Iconography is a visual language that tells you who this figure is because you see him the same way over and over and over again. It's like Mickey Mouse or Bart Simpson today. It's almost like branding. We know that when we see a character with those same physical characteristics, or maybe even engaging in the same activity, like writing a book or raising the dead, for example, then we know that that is a Christ figure. We know that when you see this handsome, soulful-eyed, long-bearded man with a white man with a halo and a robe, that's a Christ figure. The fact that he has the Alpha and Omega on the left and right sides of his head just sort of reintroduces or reinstates that. The logic of having the Christ figure be a tall, handsome white man, we're gonna get to that in just a minute. But the fact that this imagery is underground, one, because it was able to be worshipped in secret. Two, what we're going to see later is something called iconoclasm. A lot of religious imagery was destroyed, and some of which the stuff that was preserved was easy to be preserved because you could seal off these underground rooms and just act like they were never there to begin with. But we'll talk about iconoclasm. We'll talk about the development of the Christ icon in the coming slides. Let's just do that now. So, this is the Good Shepherd. It's a Good Shepherd image. This is actually a statue of Apollo. This was created as a pagan sculpture to worship the agrarian god Apollo. He's one of the more popular Roman gods. He's one that most people have probably at least heard of. He's a sun god. He's responsible for pulling the sun across the sky behind his chariot. but he was also, because he was an agrarian god, he had a lot to do with, well, shepherdry. So, upon looking at this initially, you probably would have seen this and seen the sheep, and then read that and saw Good Shepherd, and you probably would have thought, well, that's supposed to be a representation of the Christ Messiah image. The whole metaphorical reference to him being a shepherd and leading his flock, leading his sheep, to safety along the right path. But the reason that this is a repurposed version of the Christ image is because the Romans embraced Christianity the same way they adopted other parts of other people's cultures. They would take the parts that they could use and they would sort of leave everything else. So when they began to enforce Christianity, they would go into the temples, and a lot of the gods and goddesses just had to be destroyed. They just had to be done away with because there was no place for them anymore. But just so happens that they could take this Apollo figure, and all of a sudden, well, you can still keep that figure, but now his name is Jesus Christ, and that is your Messiah. So as they were structuring the religion and they were coming up for it with a face for it, this is the one, this handsome white man, because Apollo was a handsome white guy, tall, athletic built white guy. Despite the fact that any one of these people could have pulled out a map and they could have found Jerusalem or Bethlehem or Nazareth, and probably could have figured out in a hurry that there weren't a lot of tall white people in those areas. So the reason that this icon developed the way that it did is because the Christ figure is essentially a repurposed Apollo figure. And you can see this next generation where he still hasn't quite grown into his beard yet, but you see that nice halo, which makes him a nimbud figure. That's one of your key terms, a nimbud figure, and he's got his crucifix staff still hanging out with his sheep. You can tell by this point, this is definitely a Christ figure, whereas this one you could make an argument that, well, it could be basically any guy with a sheep. This is definitely the next generation, the development of that icon. That's what you're seeing here. This is how iconography develops. So the next big term that you're going to get to is Romanesque. And this is Romanesque architecture. Romanesque, the term means Roman-like, like the Romans would have done. And when it comes to architecture, that's really recognizable by the fact that, well, the Romans used columns, they used domes, and they used arches. And this particular structure is called the Hagia Sophia. That's how this is pronounced. I say I'm getting close to it. Hagia Sophia. Uh, it was built as a Christian structure in the Romanesque style. And if you look at all of these domes, this is a Roman architect's wet dream. They would have absolutely loved this particular building. Now, some of the differences between this and traditional Roman architecture you can see from the inside. That's one of the first things that you'll notice is all those windows, like all that natural light that's being let in. Like remember the Pantheon had to have an oculus, a big hole, 29-foot hole in the middle of the ceiling to let light in. Well, they found all sorts of ways to work around that now. All this natural light is also drawing attention to the inside of the structure, which is why this is much more decorative on the interior than you would find in say, the Pantheon, for example. So all that natural light means that you can pay attention to how you decorate the insides of the buildings now, too. Now, speaking of the insides, you see a lot of what you would expect when you hear the term Romanesque. You've got your columns and you've got arches, and then you've got these domes, and inside of the domes are other domes, and inside of those domes are arches, and those arches are mounted on columns. Like it's all Roman, but it's like Roman architecture on steroids. I mentioned before that this was built to be a Christian structure, but you see this Islamic script in these roundels on the wall. Now, the reason for that is that the Middle Ages were a really turbulent time, and because of pilgrimages, because of the Crusades, because of a lot of different things that could happen in a period of 900 years, there's a lot of cultural exchange. In addition to cultural exchange, there's actually an exchange of land and property and structures. So from time to time, this would have been converted from a Christian style structure into a mosque and then back to a mosque. And every time there would be a generation of Muslims, then they would add something to the architecture. They would dress it up just a little bit. The Christians would take back over the territory, and they would replace the Muslim roundels, the scripture, with Christian imagery. They might add something else to it, but there was this constant back and forth. And that's not isolated to the Hagia Sophia. There's a lot of structures, there's a lot of culture that you can see. Obviously, the two are starting to blend together. There's a lot of coming into contact with one another for different reasons. But this is a great example of Romanesque architecture, as is this. And just look at how much more attention is paid to the interior of this particular structure. It's extremely ornamental, and you still have here your iconography in the middle. Iconography is one of the absolute most important elements of culture that was introduced during the early Christian period. Iconography is absolutely huge. We'll talk about why in a minute. Now, when we were looking at that first map, I mentioned the name Justinian. Well, this is Emperor Justinian. This is the guy who officially declared the beginning of the Byzantine Empire in 527, 20 years before this image is made. This is supposed to be, you see the word Maximinus. This is actually an image tribute to Maximinus, who was the high priest in this particular time of the Byzantine Empire. But you can tell pretty obviously that the focal point of this image is Justinian himself. So he's the only one who's been given a halo, and the only people that are supposed to have halos are religious figures themselves. It's supposed to be the saints and the angels, the Christ figure himself, the Virgin Mary, somebody who has absolutely, uncontestedly deserved that halo. Justinian decides that he deserves one himself, and it's not a coincidence. It's also not a coincidence that you have so many people crowded on the left side of this particular image. Now, these are nice. These are members of the clergy, and they get plenty of space. Over here is supposed to be his bodyguards. Now, you see these two in the back are just represented by the tops of their heads, but they have to be there. Now, the reason they have to be there is because you have to have 13 figures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, because Justinian is essentially declaring himself a Christ figure. This is Jesus and his 12 apostles. He is essentially declaring himself Christ-like. Most people, even at this time, would have debated that that was accurate, but who am I to say? I will say that Empress Theodora, who's represented here, was known to be the backbone of the Byzantine Empire. She herself, she was actually interesting stories, like the original Pretty Woman. She was originally a dancer slash prostitute kind of, who worked in service of Justinian. She was apparently very good at her job. He declared her the queen, and on multiple occasions there were mutinies throughout the Byzantine Empire, and she was the one who maintained control. She was the one who kept Justinian from fleeing the country in fear. Now, this also gives us a really good example to discuss Byzantine style artwork. Now, the fact that you have, I'm just going to go through a few characteristics here that are typical of Byzantine style artwork. Let me zoom back in and maybe give you a little bit better perspective here. But one, you have tall, slender figures. These proportions would not have been all that accurate during this time period. We'll see later. Long, thin fingers. But for now, tall, slender figures. You've got those larger than normal eyes. Might go back to what they were doing during the Roman Empire. Remember the votive statues during the ancient Near East. So we've got that symbolic use of color. Purple is associated with royalty. It was illegal for a common person to show themselves or have themselves depicted or to wear purple because the pigment was so expensive to find. And then you've got all this gold. Gold serves a few special purposes. One, it's a display of wealth. Two, the fact that gold is so shiny and it doesn't tarnish and has all these special